It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP and former Trade Minister Conor Burns. Labour MP Rosie Duffield, Vice UK Executive Editor Zing Singh, and Daily Telegraph columnist and sketchwriter Madeline Grant. Today, this interview dominates the news.
Concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
What?
Fabulous, fabulous. Looking good. Come on ahead.
Millions of children go back to school. In secondary schools, they'll be tested and be asked to wear masks in class.
From the teenagers that I spoke to, they really get this. They want to keep not only themselves safe, but they want to keep their friends safe, their family safe.
And is this the Prime Minister's final word on NHS pay?
We're in a pretty tough times. We've tried to give the NHS as much as we possibly can.
Let's start with the interview that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have given to Oprah Winfrey. Let's take a look at a couple of the paper headlines, starting with the Daily Mail. How dark will baby skin be? And that is underlined in the Daily Mirror too, with its headline. They asked how dark Archie's skin would be. Let's have a listen to a little bit more of the interview.
In those months when I was pregnant, all around this same time, so we have in tandem the conversation of he won't be given security, he's not going to be given a title, and also concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
What? So were you thinking of harming yourself? Were you having suicidal thoughts?
Yes, this was very, very clear.
Wow.
Very clear and very scary. And, you know, I didn't know who to even turn to in that.
So the interview was broadcast last night in the United States. It will be broadcast this evening, but of course we know much of the content. Let's discuss some of it with the BBC's royal correspondent Sarah Campbell. Sarah, the Duchess of Sussex said some hugely serious things and revelations in that interview. How damaging is this to the institution of the monarchy?
Yes, I mean, it was unclear before the interview as to just sort of what exactly would be said, how far would the couple go. It's not just Meghan, it's Harry as well. And as you say, they really didn't hold back. So I think the sort of, if you look at the two most damaging, potentially, allegations, concerns that they have, I think the first one is Meghan's mental health. She talked about the fact that there were times that she felt she didn't want to be alive. And while she was pregnant, she talked about having suicidal thoughts. And perhaps, above all this, perhaps most damaging is the fact that she says that she went to the institution, she asked for help, she explained that she was having trouble, and she was basically not given that help and sort of told that that's not possible. So that was the first allegation about mental health. And as you heard from that clip there was this issue over potential racism. The allegation being that Harry, there was a conversation with an unnamed member of the royal family who talked about what colour Archie's skin might be, their baby's skin might be, and he passed that on to Meghan. Both of them were asked to identify which member of the royal household said that, and neither of them would do that. Meghan said it would be too damaging to them to say that. So clearly, those are two areas which really will give the palace much to think about in terms of how they might have handled it and what reaction, if any, they're going to give off the back of this interview.
Right, well, since you mentioned that, do we expect any response from Buckingham Palace to the interview?
It's a good question. The channels so far are quiet. It's a long interview. There are a lot of points in there, and so there is a lot to digest. There is a lot to reflect on. I would imagine the one thing they're not going to do is give a quick reaction. But in answer, do I definitely know or not know whether they're going to give one? The answer to that is no. We simply have to wait and see.
All right, Sarah Campbell, thank you very much. Journalists are at the Daily Lobby briefing at number 10 and will expect the spokesperson to be asked about this, and will bring you any response if there is one. Connor, this goes beyond the personal, doesn't it? Because Meghan Markle says at times, as we heard there, she felt suicidal and didn't get the support she asked for from the institution. And somebody, possibly a member of the royal family, asked a question about how dark their baby's skin would be when he was born. What's your response?
Well, Jo, you've hit the nail on the question in the question you posed to your royal correspondent a moment ago. What response will there be from the palace, from the institution? We know the answer. There won't be one. There can't be one. And therefore, we have heard this. Things have been said, but there cannot be a response. And that's the difficulty of this. I have the greatest admiration for Her Majesty the Queen. I'm excited next year to celebrate her Platinum Jubilee. I think at this time, we think of her, and in particular, the Duke of Edinburgh, wishing him a speedy recovery. But I am genuinely not convinced that politicians wading into this is helpful, and therefore I really don't have anything to say on it.
Right, you say it won't be helpful for politicians, as you put it, to wade into this, but this is now quite a big, potentially constitutional discussion, and politicians will be asked about it. I'm absolutely sure they will pose those questions at today's lobby briefing.
Well, look, the couple in the past have stressed their desire for privacy, their desire for a life beyond being senior and active members of the royal family. They've indeed gone to they use the instruments of the law to try and enforce that desire for privacy, and I will respect that today.
Rosie, what do you think the impact is going to be more broadly on the monarchy, and do politicians have something to say about this and the revelations that have been expressed?
I think women in the public eye can all relate to what Meghan has been through to a certain extent. I mean, obviously on a much, much smaller scale as a British MP, but we read all kinds of stuff about ourselves in the press all the time. And, you know, this poor young woman had to come into this well-established institution that was probably very alien to her. So I think just on a human level, we can relate to some of what she might have experienced, having read that, you know, the highlights of that interview. Obviously, we haven't seen it yet, but I'll be watching. And I feel very strongly that she obviously didn't feel that she had the support she needed. And that's horrible and shocking. And I think we all ought to look out for each other in this situation. She's just a person as well as being part of the royal family.
Zing, we know, or suggestions from polling, that there is a generational difference broadly in opinion regarding the royal family. Younger people tend to sympathise with Harry and Meghan, older people with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. Do you think this interview and its ramifications will result in the royal family and the institution becoming less relevant?
I mean, just looking at the fallout from this interview and the way that the palace has handled the lead up to this interview, I mean, it's enough to make anyone a Republican. And I certainly know many young people who prior to this had no strong feelings about the monarchy one way or another, but now strongly feel as if it's a very outdated, even prejudiced institution. And I think what the Harry and Meghan interview provided was a peek behind a facade of what it means to be a royal and what exactly their responsibilities are. I mean, there are instances in that interview in which Meghan seems to have felt that it was all a kind of PR facade where she wasn't given the support she needed behind the scenes and was still expected to play the part of the good wife and the good princess out in public. And I think that, you know, this is really going to speak to a generation of people who have grown up seeing modern progressive women like Meghan Markle in the public eye and then viewing her treatment at the hands of the royal family as being incredibly unfair. So I wouldn't be surprised if in a few decades to come, we might be having instead a referendum on the royal family and whether or not the taxpayer should continue to fund the royal family at all.
Right, Madeleine, do you think it will change the discussion? Because we have had this before. We've heard the phrase being used by Prince Harry, this is repeating, or he was worried about history repeating itself. Do you worry whether any harm is being done to the standing of the monarchy? Does the country risk losing something too?
I think it does, and I do think that there is a generational element. I mean, I personally am very strongly monarchist, and I obviously have some sympathy with the suffering that Harry and Meghan have gone through, and the fact that the royal family has so clearly failed to find a proper role for them within the family firm. But I also think that, the thing that makes me really uncomfortable about the interview is that it offered one version of events. And as Connor said, we're not privy to the royal family's take on what happened. And we're not going to hear it either, because they cannot speak in the same way. It's not as if the Queen is allowed to sit down with Oprah and bare her soul. And this is the problem, that I think that this snapshot view of things is being put out there without the possibility for the kind of the similar opportunity to be so explicit about the details. And I do think that in some ways that some of the points that have been raised in this interview have been done in a rather thoughtless way. So, for example, the question about this senior member of the royal family who appears to have said some racist concerns about the skin colour of baby Archie. I think that without putting that remark into context, without naming the royal family member in question, they have, in a sense, put them all under suspicion. And I think that is really unfair. But at the same time, I do think that there'll be a lot of people watching this interview who will look at the timing of it and say, was this really appropriate? What with Prince Philip in hospital, a pandemic raging around the world, killing millions and leaving people in unimaginable penury, to hear these two, in many ways, even though, having suffered greatly in the public eye, but also being financially very well off, to be complaining about the fact that their family cut them off financially. I think that just as this has raised some very shocking and potentially explosive claims that the royal family will need to answer in some way, it has also, I think, many will be questioning, was this the right time to be airing these grievances and in this way?
All right, we're going to leave it there. It is dominating the news, but there's lots to talk about. Schools, for example, in just a moment, because today it marks the first stage in the government's roadmap out of lockdown. You will know now that you can walk with someone in England from another household and sit in the park and have coffee. And one nominated person can visit their relative inside a care home, which will be great comfort to many millions of families in England. It's also the return of all children to school in England. And Branwen Jeffries is the BBC's education editor, and she's at Bohunt Secondary School in Worthing. Branwen, it's a big day back. It won't quite be business as usual, though, will it?
Certainly not in big secondary schools like this, Jo, because they're having to stagger the return of pupils so they can test them in small batches. So they've got a couple of year groups coming in today. They will have their tests in small groups, and then they'll go home to await the results. The school will have the result for each pupil within about 30 minutes. And if it's negative, they should be able to come back into school and start lessons as normal tomorrow.
Now, there is one question about testing, Branwen, because the schools minister said this morning that if a child tests positive using the lateral flow test that's being done in schools, they'll be sent for a PCR test, which is seen as being more sensitive and sophisticated. If that were to come back negative, the child would still need to stay home and self-isolate. Is that correct?
So there are two stages to this. If we sort of re-rack on that, it's slightly more complicated than that suggests. Children are being asked to have 3 tests supervised in their secondary school to make sure they do it properly. If they have a positive from that test in school, they don't have to have a PCR test afterwards. They simply self-isolate to get through those 3 tests. After that, when they're doing twice weekly tests at home themselves, unsupervised, if they get a positive, they are then expected to have a PCR test. If it's negative at that point, they can then come straight back into school.
Right, well, thank you very much for explaining it. Now, talk a little bit more about the mask wearing in secondary schools and the response to it.
Well, secondary schools have taken varying approaches over this year. The big step, of course, now is that they're going to have to wear them in the classroom, in other words, pretty much the whole day for teenagers in England from now on until Easter, when the policy will be reviewed. Some secondary schools took the view last September that they wanted to introduce them in corridors and communal areas, regardless of the government guidance, going further than the government guidance at that time. And so for those schools, it's a slightly smaller step. It's fair to say that teenagers have a fairly mixed response to the idea of sitting with masks on the whole day.
I can imagine.
But head teachers are saying, look, let's not make a big battle over this. We need to be able to manage this sensibly. If someone needs to take their mask off for a few moments to get some fresh air, we'll just manage that without it becoming a big confrontation.
Branwen Jeffries, thank you. I know you've got a busy day ahead. And just to mention that in Northern Ireland, pupils in primary schools years 1 to 3 also return to the classroom. Let's talk to the panel about this. Conor Burns, they're back, and it has to be forever this time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that we have been going perhaps more slowly than some would wish on the reopening. The Prime Minister was very, very clear, has been in public and in private, that he wants this to be the last lockdown and therefore take it gradually, take it slowly, make sure it's working. Just one point, because I know this is felt very strongly by head teachers and teachers in my own constituency down here in Bournemouth. Schools aren't opening today. They're opening to all pupils today. Yeah. And head teachers and teachers have done an absolutely amazing job throughout this pandemic of keeping the classroom open to children of key workers, amongst others. So I just want to salute them. I think you'll have unanimity across the panel on that. They've done a brilliant job, and it's so welcome for parents, but above all, for the children, because we've got a really big job now to help those young people make up for the missed opportunities, the missed education that this pandemic has inflicted on them.
Yes, I mean, Rosie, and I'm sure the others will agree with that sentiment entirely. But Rosie, are you convinced that it will be irreversible, this return to schools for all pupils?
We don't know, do we? Let's really hope so. My son's going back today, and I know that his school during the last sort of wave of being allowed back to school were really responsible with the masks. And I have to say, all this stuff about teenagers not wanting to wear them, I've seen so many groups of teenagers, even when adults were not walking along the streets, sort of, especially here in Westminster, wearing them really responsibly. They don't seem to feel that they're not cool. They're just sort of getting on with what they know is safest. So let's not sort of imagine that teenagers are all trying to rip them off and be silly and cause mayhem, because they're not at all. You know, the ones that I know, my son's 18 and his friends have been really responsible. So I think that as long as schools can sort of sort out this slightly complicated testing system, we should be okay. But I know that the Kent variant was largely made much worse by people going back too soon, and schools were not prepared. You know, they weren't given enough guidance or enough help to sort of keep them safe. And every week in my constituency, there was at least one school and one school year group shutting down. And I kept thinking, what's going on here? And then we found out that there was this really rife variant going through the schools. So long as that doesn't happen, I think we should be, you know, hopeful.
Right. I mean, Madeleine, it's interesting, the discussion around masks. I mean, listening to Rosie, they're saying her son and her son's friends aren't bothered about it, but some teenagers are, and some parents of teenagers are, including some Conservative MPs. Do you sympathise with the fact that the guidance is now for secondary school pupils to wear face coverings during classes and in the corridors?
Yes, I do. I would personally wouldn't like to spend the day wearing a mask. I think it would hamper concentration, and I think doubly so in schools, because communication is so important. You need to have that be able to converse properly with each other and with teachers. And I do think that, you know, we this is all being justified on a kind of on the basis of precaution. You know, we're doing this based on just in case. You know, we can't be too careful about schools. At the same time, I completely empathise with that. But at the same time, I do think that we need to perhaps think about where is the precaution when it comes to the fact that we've never taken kids out of school for this long, for such a long period, depriving them of social contact. At the same time that we have this incredible vaccination programme has protected an extraordinary high share of the most vulnerable people. And we really should be worrying about hospitalisations rather than how many cases there are in the community. And mask wearing in schools is something that is likely to impact the ability of children to learn. And I do think that at this point, judging the risks, I think the children have sacrificed an awful lot for this return to normality and for the health of the nation. And it's about time that we began to prioritise them.
Right, well, Conor, Madeleine isn't the only one who's sceptical. There are Conservative MPs and also Boris Johnson himself last year. Let's have a listen.
If you're in a hotspot area where there is a higher risk of transmission, then face coverings in those types of areas outside the classroom. But not in the classroom, because that's clearly nonsensical. You can't teach with face coverings, and you can't expect people to learn with face coverings.
Well, Conor, how do you explain that?
Well, look, where's the guidance coming from? The guidance on masks in schools is coming from Public Health England. I think that the government's taking quite a sensible and pragmatic approach to that, which is giving this guidance to schools, to head teachers to make with it as they want, and then review it at Easter. Easter isn't too far away. Yes, it was the third Sunday of Lent. We'll have a look at Easter and we'll see, and if it's not necessary, we'll move away from it. But I think the point that's just been made is the vital one, is what we now do to make sure we help those young people catch up. And that's why we put 1.7 billion into the COVID education, COVID recovery fund, 200 million for face-to-face summer camps in schools, the appointment of Kevin Collins as the COVID education recovery commissioner. We accept there's a massive job to do, and we stand ready to do everything we can to help head teachers, parents, give the time, the opportunity for those young people to catch up. We realise what a heinous blow this has been, but what I would wonder, if we were ignoring the advice of Public Health England now, what would others be saying about that decision?
Right, but Zing, the Prime Minister said it was nonsensical to expect kids to wear these masks or face coverings during class. What do you make of the change?
I mean, I think it just speaks overall to the government just changing its mind on a whole bunch of different issues, depending on the way it's been received by the public, the way it's been received by the papers and the press, and battling with that and trying to balance that with the official guidance from Public Health England. So I really do think that in the conversation around schools and people going back to school, the voices of those who are actually teaching these children and also supporting these children in their education has been completely forgotten. So Gavin Williamson said he was fighting tooth and nail to get teaching staff and support staff prioritized for the vaccine, but there has been no mention of that in the last few weeks as schools reopened. 9 teaching unions said that they didn't feel comfortable with the return to school, and they said it was reckless endangerment. You know, and I can speak from this from a personal perspective because my partner is a teacher, and actually they caught COVID from an infected student in their classroom and then passed on that infection to me. So when people talk about, you know, classrooms not being a site of transmission, even anecdotally, I know that's not to be true.
Well, Connor, what do you say in response?
I say, look, we've asked the committee who are looking at vaccines to make their recommendations. And I think it is sensible and prudent to follow their advice, which is what we're doing, which is those who are oldest and with underlying health conditions are the most likely to be hospitalized and die from contraction of the COVID virus, and therefore it is right and proper. And indeed, I think the only thing that is sensible to do is to vaccinate first those at greatest risk. And there is no evidence that younger teachers are any more susceptible to being hospitalized or dying from COVID than other people in similar age groups. If there are people in the teaching profession, in schools, teaching assistants and so on, who are within the at-risk age group or have underlying health conditions, they will be eligible for early vaccination. The key thing is to carry on doing the brilliant work that we're doing in rolling out this vaccine to as many people in the population as quickly as possible.
Zing?
I mean, if that were the case, if vaccines were only most effective in judging from age categories, then why bother vaccinating NHS staff and support staff on the NHS? You know, these teachers are frontline employees just as much as a nurse, just as much as a doctor. As you yourself said earlier, Connor, you know, these are teachers who have been keeping the schools open for the children of NHS staff themselves. You know, they deserve better respect and they deserve to be taken care of more than they have by the government. They don't deserve to be seen as just free childcare for people who are a bit fed up of having to educate their children at home. They have support needs as well, and they have concerns about their health. And I know that whilst, you know, the data currently suggests that teachers who tend to be of a younger demographic are less likely to be hospitalized and less likely to suffer from severe COVID, there's been an emerging amount of evidence talking about the effects of long COVID on younger people. And we have to be respectful of that as well. We're effectively asking people like teachers to put their lives on the line and to risk their health in the long term to help educate our children. And I think personally, they deserve more respect than that.
Connor?
We have asked a committee of experts to look at this and to make recommendations. And ministers are following their medical, clinical, scientific judgment on what is the best decision on who to give this vaccine a priority. And that is what we're doing. And I think to do otherwise would be negligent.
All right, let me just draw your attention, and Rosie in particular, to the story in the Daily Telegraph today, which says unions school masks threat. Now, this is the Association of School and College Leavers Union, who've said that unless face coverings are made compulsory, it could end up with too few kids wearing them and invalidating the school's risk assessment. Rosie, what do you think?
I think teachers have been through so much. You know, their morale is low, they're exhausted. We all know that when you are on your knees with exhaustion, you're susceptible even more to anything that's going around. And I think they absolutely have to have as much protection as is possible.
Right.
So they're probably going to have to make it compulsory. And I understand unions' concerns about teachers not being vaccinated as well. I mean, it makes perfect sense. But you know, obviously Public Health England have got their tier system and, you know, who's going to get the vaccine first. NHS, but teachers have got to be protected, and children mostly are okay with wearing masks from my experience. I think they're going to have to just do that to protect teachers because, you know, they're there on the front line.
Right, OK, so you would like to see that face covering guidance made compulsory? OK, well, look, let's move on, because the government has been defending its proposal that NHS staff should get a 1% pay rise in the next financial year. Now, Boris Johnson said the offer is as much as the government can afford in the current economic circumstances. Here's what the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, told Andrew Marr yesterday.
We've stated, and as has been stated just last week, this is very much part of the process, what the government has put forward as part of an independent review. That's what the government has set out as, just last week. But we are continuing to invest in the NHS.
Madeleine, do you think the government's going to stick to this proposal, or will it change its mind?
I'm not sure. I don't know what they're going to do next, but I do think that they have created a very difficult political situation for them right now, because we've all seen it throughout the pandemic how the government has embraced the kind of the magic money tree in all kinds of ways. And though it may now claim that it can't afford, to offer a hike in pay that would be more than what is currently a sort of real terms pay cut, or at least not much of a rise. But when they've been spraying money around left, right and centre, and when things like the pensions triple lock, for example, has been protected, it does become very difficult to argue for any kind of fiscal prudence. I would say that what is perhaps more likely than this becoming a long-standing pay hike for nurses, there may be more likely and perhaps more politically sensible to try and make it a kind of one-off payment to recognise the incredibly difficult and stressful year that has left many nurses feeling completely burnt out.
Connor?
Look, I have huge sympathy with the position that both ministers are in and the nursing profession is in. My neighbour here in Bournemouth is a nurse. She was at the front line in the Royal Bournemouth Hospital during the peak of the COVID crisis. I saw how stressed she was, how tired she was. But I also see, as I go around my own constituency, I see leisure and hospitality businesses that have been closed and owners who are worried about whether they're going to be able to reopen. Their taxes fund the public sector. The economy's taken an absolutely devastating hit by COVID. Government have come forward and said, we think 1%. That is fed into the pay review process, and the pay review body will come back in the spring with their recommendations. And I think that's when ministers will have to look at that recommendation and make the final decision.
Rosie, do you think that's fair?
I think it's absolutely outrageous, and I think most of the public also agree with that. I mean, the 1% pay rise was the equivalent of £3.50 a week. Nurses have been asking for a decent amount of pay for years now. The public sector have had their pay frozen for a long time. They've been suffering the result of austerity in those decisions for a decade. It's about time that we value the people that are literally saving our lives. And when nurses and frontline workers and porters and cleaners and everyone that keeps our hospitals working are reading about the millions of pounds spent on redecorating the private apartments in Downing Street and the new media suite they've got there, they've every right to feel completely insulted. And I hope this is going to be another government U-turn.
Connor?
Well, that's a great soundbite, isn't it? I mean, I had a constituent yesterday who emailed me, said what had happened to the £35 million that Captain Sir Tom Moore had raised. Surely that could be used. We're talking about enormous figures that are put into the National Health Service, another £6 billion this year alone. Newly qualified nurses have had a 12% pay increase over the last 3 years in the pay round. We're recruiting an additional 50,000 nurses. I'm very sympathetic. I'm more than sympathetic.
Right.
Everyone who's seen the way they have risen to the challenge, the deep distress that they've been afflicted with in dealing with it, will understand this. Ministers have said 1%. That's fed into the pay review process. The pay review body will come back with a recommendation, and ministers will then have to make the decision in the spring, not today.
Rosie, there is a process to go through.
Well, let's just wait and see what the independent peer review says. But I mean, I can't believe that this is okay. And the people that are deciding, we're not putting our lives on the front line. You know, we're getting £80,000 a year. So I think it is disgusting. I think the public and the unions and health staff are rightly, really outraged by this.
Right, and on that, Rosie, what do you think should happen then to the pay of nurses and other NHS staff next year? Labour so far hasn't given a figure, but you obviously don't think 1% is enough, so what would be?
No, it needs to be enough to reflect the fact that many nurses have been using food banks and that they are literally putting their lives on the line. We need to consult with the unions and the RCN and listen to what they're telling us they want, rather than just hand down some sort of random figure that isn't going to make a difference to their lives.
Right. I mean, Connor, a random figure. There is public outcry over this, and particularly because politicians like Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, said repeatedly during the pandemic last year that he wanted to see NHS staff properly rewarded. You can understand why people aren't accepting this.
I can understand the frustration, and more than frustration, but we're talking about a 1% pay rise here, but we're talking about no pay rises across the rest of the public sector. And then we look at the private sector, who have really had, in dire straits because of the pandemic. And as we see, despite the billions that the Chancellor has put in through furlough and grants through local authorities to support businesses, many of those businesses, when the economy reopens, will not survive. I've had some of the most distressing personal situations of people coming to me who have invested their entire lives into building a business that now hangs by a thread. And it is, Jo, and I'm sorry to come back to this, it is the profits of the private sector that is there to fund the money that we pay on the public sector, NHS included. And we are in really, really serious economic times. And I think the public absolutely understand that.
Madeleine, you're nodding in agreement?
Yes, I very much agree with that. I think that people often support greater public spending, particularly for frontline workers who've behaved truly heroically over the last year. But it's often what I would suggest more in the abstract. It's greater public spending, but not necessarily that I have to pay for it. It's always someone else that has to pay for it. And I do actually think that these particular arguments could become even more heated when, for example, the furlough scheme ends and the destruction that is taking place in the private sector is felt properly. Because at the same time that this has happened, and Connor's quite right to talk about the wages in the private sector have deteriorated, there have been mass layoffs, millions have been furloughed on 80% pay. I think that the appetite for these kind of pay increases, once the reality of the fact that they do have to be funded out of the nation's finances, which are in an absolutely parlous state at the moment, some people may start to change their minds about this.
Right, Zing, what about you? You were shaking your head there in disagreement about this issue between the private sector and the public sector in this pandemic.
I mean, the idea that the private sector has unilaterally suffered enormous losses across the pandemic is absolutely untrue. I mean, you just need to look at how rich this pandemic has made someone like Jeff Bezos to understand that that isn't the case. And, I'm a huge supporter of a tax on the companies that have profited and done very, very well out of the pandemic in order to fund pay rises for the people who have, to be frank, kept this country going. People like nurses, doctors, teachers. These are the people who should be rewarded for having lived through one of the worst years of their life. It is intensely traumatic, I think, in a way that not many people are reckoning with right now. And I think the least that we can do is to turn to the companies that have done very well out of these quote unquote unprecedented times and to pass on their profits onto the people who have suffered the most.
Madeleine?
I would just say to that the average wage in the public sector is higher than the average wage in the private sector. Of course, there are people at the top who make big profits, but I'm talking about rank and file taxpayers who see that they are suffering, that many of them have lost their businesses, that they put their life and soul into, and things have been taken away from them by the government diktat, and they don't see themselves being rewarded on anything like the same scale. And fundamentally, someone has to pay for all of this.
Right, Rosie, can we just go back to the issue of what Labour would like? You say it shouldn't be a random figure, but the government has put out a figure of 1%. Now, you may completely disagree with it, and you do. But why is Labour not prepared to put a figure on it? You must have an idea of what you think would be a valid reward.
I don't know. It's certainly not for me. I'm not on the front bench or the leader of the opposition. But I think in conjunction with talking, talking to the unions, talking to those bodies, I can't speak for them, and I don't know if Keir will do that later on in interviews. But can I just say as well that absolutely Madeleine had a point about the private sector, but it shouldn't be either or. Everyone has suffered in this pandemic, but weren't the government saving money for the last decade by imposing austerity on all of us? Where's that money then? And why can't public sector workers now benefit from that, as well as people getting some of the furlough money that they need?
Well, Connor, where's the money?
What we've just been through, is the equivalent of the debt build-up, the First World War, the Second World War. This has been, not just once in a generation, once every 50 years this sort of thing happens. In terms of a health pandemic, once every 100 years or more. This is absolutely unprecedented. And the Chancellor, by the way, was right. It was because of difficult decisions taken from 2010, both in the coalition and subsequently, that meant the public finances were in a robust enough position to allow us, without severe risk, to take the measures that we have taken in terms of business support and furlough, principally delivered through local authorities. But we've got to now start to look to the future and how we get the public finances on a more sustainable footing, because ultimately it'll be future generations who pay. And the idea that you pick a random company and say, well, if only they paid a bit more, or pick a project that's happening in government, say, if we didn't do that, these are peanuts. These are drops of water in an ocean by comparison with the difficulties we're facing. We've got to get the private sector up and running again and motoring again to create the income, to create the wealth, to allow us to do all the things that I think we all would like to do for nurses. But we've got to recognise the severity of the economic context we're in at the moment.
Did you want to respond, Zing?
I mean, I understand the attraction of thinking as if coronavirus is the last ever viral pandemic we are ever going to face in our times, but that simply isn't the case. Why underinvest in the workforce of the NHS? Because there are already nurses saying that if they don't get a higher pay rise, they'll simply go abroad and work for somewhere else. Why underinvest in the NHS and then be caught completely off guard when another pandemic comes along and gutters both the NHS and the private sector?
All right, just before we move on...
but just 1 second, actually, that's not factually correct, because we are trying to recruit 50,000 new nurses, and the number of people coming forward for training, particularly since we reinstated the nurse bursary, which, by the way, we should never have got rid of, has actually been really, really high, and that's really positive. There are people, particularly after the pandemic and through the pandemic, who see what an amazing profession nursing is and want to come forward and be part of it.
All right, just before we move on, though, quickly, Conor, do you think the government will stick to its guns on this, or do you think they will perform a U-turn, as they have on many other critical issues?
Well, look, I think the government have put a figure out there. I'm not going to score a point on it, but at least the government have, while others haven't put a figure out there. There's now the proper process, and the independent pay review body will come back. I suspect if they come back with something different, there will be pressure on ministers. But we've put out a starting point, and as the Prime Minister said yesterday, we put that starting point out there based on the severity of the economic context we're in at the moment. And 1%, it is small, but it's more than most of the rest of the public
you've
sector.
explained that. I just wanted to know on the politics of it. Before we move on, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has been asked about the interview between Oprah Winfrey and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Let's have a listen.
I think they need to be taken very, very seriously. They are allegations in relation to race and to mental health, and for too many years, this is bigger than the royal family, for too many years we've been too dismissive and too willing to put these issues to one side. Can't do that. Serious allegations need to be taken seriously.
Keir Starmer responding to that interview. Now, we're going to move on to something that involves Rosie Duffield, because you haven't been on the programme, Rosie, since you were caught up in a Twitter row last year on social media. The Evening Standard covered it like this. Labour MP Rosie Duffield embroiled in transphobia row after cervical cancer tweet. Now, this was a tweet by CNN, which said individuals with a cervix are now recommended to start cervical cancer screening at 25. Now, you were flooded with complaints after you liked the broadcaster Piers Morgan's reply to that tweet, which read, "Do you mean women?" And you were accused of being a transphobe. Now, you since apologised for any offence caused by your language, but has it made you consider more carefully what you say on social media when it comes to sensitive issues like this?
No. Social media is a cesspit, and it's particularly awful for women in the public eye and women MPs. We've all seen what's happened to Diane Abbott and Jess Phillips and others. You know, basically you're not allowed an opinion that some people don't agree with. You know, in this particular instance, I didn't even particularly express my opinion. I liked someone else's tweet and was piled in on. It's a debate and a discussion. You know, I don't think that we should have, you know, one bit of an argument ending up, you know, as the right one and everyone else should be cancelled. I think it's really toxic, and we should all be allowed to discuss these things in a safe way. And obviously Twitter just isn't the sort of platform for that, social media in general, but it's just a real shame the way that people get categorised and silenced and piled in on, and I think it just discourages a proper grown-up conversation.
Zing, do you agree with the point that women are treated more unfairly online and in social media exchanges?
I definitely think women are targeted more extremely on social media, and I include among that trans women. You know, you have someone like the UN Women's Advocate Monroe Bergdorf being driven off social media, Twitter specifically, because of the amount of bullying and harassment she's received. And I completely empathize with, Rosie's experience of being harassed online, because I've received some incredibly vile racist and sexist abuse in my time as a journalist. But I'd also like to highlight that, as an MP, her actions have weight and they have merit. Even by favoriting a tweet, for instance, and then refusing to back down on it, you're contributing to a toxic atmosphere in which transgender rights are considered up for debate when they're not. And also, it also contributes towards this atmosphere that, transgender people can and should be questioned, when in fact, trans people in daily life are subject to enormous amounts of harassment, both physical and offline and online. I mean, a recent Stonewall report found that 1 in 8 trans people have been physically attacked at work. And I find that statistic completely shocking. And I think that as MPs, people have a responsibility to conduct themselves in a way that is inclusive and respectful, especially if you're a Labour MP for a party that claims to be all about equality. So unfortunately on this area, I think I'm going to have to disagree with Rosie. While I empathize deeply and sympathize with her account of bullying, I just simply don't think that, trying to kind of crowbar this into you being silenced or censored for your opinion is really going to wash.
Right, and do you think being an MP has that extra layer of responsibility, Rosie?
Absolutely, but there is no right and wrong. Just because I had a different opinion doesn't mean that I deserve to be cancelled. We were talking about women's bodies and a women's issue. Most people are women. There are a few people, I've now sort of broadened my understanding about trans men who probably still have certain women's organs. That's something that most women don't actually think about or know about. We were talking about women's health and a women's health issue, and particularly language is important. The idea that you have to write women with an X now, or stop using the word woman and stop talking about biological sex, is deeply frightening and also offensive to the majority of women that I speak to.
Zing?
I don't think it's frightening or offensive to the majority of women that I speak to. So I'm afraid we're just going to have to disagree on this.
Okay.
I think that most people would agree that inclusive language is enormously important. Think back to a couple of decades ago when people kicked up such a fuss over gender neutral language in, firefighters and police officers, and said that we should just only be calling them policemen and firemen because the majority of men occupy those positions. Didn't we stick up for the women who wanted to be firefighters and wanted to be police officers, and said that this language should include them as well, even though they might have been a minority at the time? To me, this issue is no different.
All right. And Madeleine, do you think women are subjected to more abuse on social media?
I think they are. I think there is a tendency for women to be kind of sexualised, for their gender to be weaponised against them. So you get specifically sexualised forms of abuse. But I agree with Rosie that social media is often a cesspit. I do think that a culture of nasty intimidation has sprung up against women with traditional ideas about biological sex. And by traditional, I mean ones that are shared by the vast majority of the population. It's interesting to me that it's inevitably women who are described as individuals with a cervix. I've never heard a man described as an individual with a prostate or something. And it's almost a metaphor for, in the way, when we're having the debate about all-female spaces, about sports competitions, about unisex loos, about prisons, the upshot, the outcome always seems to be that it's women who you miss out and suffer, and not the men. And I think it's sort of ironic in a way that on International Women's Day, there seems to be a level of offence about even using the word woman. I mean, if we can't call a spade, then what hope is there? And I think I have a great deal of admiration for women who are willing to stick their head above the parapet, such as Alison Bailey, the lawyer who is currently taking Stonewall to court because they're trying to get her taken out of her job for having expressed these sorts of opinions.
We haven't got long. Connor, your view?
Well, I just think the whole social media thing, I think should be called anti-social media. I often use an old quote in correspondence with constituents who disagree with me that goes along the lines of 2 reasonable people can perfectly reasonably reach opposite conclusions based on the same set of facts without each surrendering their right to be considered a reasonable person. And I experienced this as a gay man who's also Catholic on same-sex marriage. The abuse was horrendous. We shouldn't have to live with it. It's wrong. We should have a much more civilised discourse in our politics.
Well, we're ending on a civilised note there. Thank you to all of our guests today on Politics Live. I will be back tomorrow at the same time, 12:15.